The thunder of cannons echoed across the Chesapeake Bay as British warships closed in on the American frigate Chesapeake in the summer of 1807. What began as a routine patrol would ignite tensions that had been simmering since the Treaty of Paris ended the Revolutionary War in 1783. The British HMS Leopard had demanded to search the American vessel for deserters, and when Captain James Barron refused, the British opened fire without warning. This incident, known as the Chesapeake Leopard Affair, crystallized the growing animosity between the young United States and its former colonial master. For nearly 3 decades after independence, America had struggled to establish its place among nations, only to find itself caught between the titanic struggle of Britain and Napoleonic France. The roots of what would become the War of 1812 ran deeper than any single maritime incident. They stretched back to fundamental questions about American sovereignty, economic independence, and the right to navigate the seas as a free nation. President Thomas Jefferson faced an impossible situation. British naval supremacy meant that Royal Navy ships routinely stopped American merchant vessels on the high seas, claiming the right to search for British deserters and often impressing American sailors into service. The practice of impressment had become a national humiliation, with an estimated 6,000 American seamen forced into British service between 1803 and 1812. These men, torn from their families and livelihoods, became unwilling participants in Britain's struggle against Napoleon. The economic warfare between Britain and France further strangled American commerce. The British Orders in Council of 1807 effectively blockaded European ports controlled by France. While Napoleon's continental system sought to exclude British goods from European markets, caught between these competing trade restrictions, American merchants found their ships seized by both powers, their cargoes confiscated, and their profits evaporating. The young nation's economy, heavily dependent on maritime trade, suffered tremendously under these competing blockades, as documented in historical records from the Library of Congress archives. The situation grew increasingly untenable as British naval officers became more aggressive in their searches of American vessels. In the bustling ports of New York, Boston, and Charleston, stories circulated of American citizens dragged from their ships and forced into the harsh conditions aboard British men of war. These tales of injustice and humiliation spread through coastal communities like wildfire, building public sentiment for action against British aggression. The western frontier presented another source of conflict that would ultimately contribute to the declaration of war. British traders and officials in Canada maintained relationships with Native American tribes along the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley, providing them with weapons and encouraging resistance to American expansion. Prominent leaders like Tecumseh of the Shawnee and his brother Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, had begun forming a confederacy of tribes determined to halt American settlement beyond the Ohio River. American settlers and politicians increasingly blamed British interference for Native American raids on frontier settlements. By 1808, the situation had deteriorated to the point where President Jefferson attempted to use economic pressure through the Embargo Act, which prohibited American ships from trading with any foreign nation. However, this self-imposed isolation proved more damaging to American interests than to those of Britain or France. New England merchants, whose livelihoods depended on international trade, suffered enormously, and smuggling became rampant along the Canadian border. The embargo was widely regarded as a failure and was repealed just before Jefferson left office in 1809. Jefferson's successor, James Madison, inherited a nation divided over how to respond to continued British provocations. The Federalist Party, strongest in New England, generally favored accommodation with Britain and opposed any actions that might lead to war. However, a new generation of politicians had emerged in Congress, led by figures like Henry Clay of Kentucky and John Caldwell Calhoun of South Carolina. These war hawks, as they came to be known, viewed British actions as intolerable affronts to American honor and independence. They argued that the United States had fought too hard for independence to allow Britain to treat it as a vassal state once again. The stage was set for a conflict that would test whether the American experiment in Republican government could survive its second major war with the world's greatest naval power. The morning of June 1st, 1812, found President James Madison pacing the floors of the Executive Mansion, wrestling with the most momentous decision of his presidency. Outside, the sweltering heat of Washington's summer had already begun to settle over the young capital. But inside the presidential residence, the atmosphere was charged with the tension of impending war. Madison, a slight man whose intellectual prowess had earned him recognition as the father of the Constitution, now faced the prospect of leading his nation into its second conflict with Great Britain. The pressure had been mounting for months. When Congress, the war hawks had grown increasingly vocal and influential. Henry Clay, the charismatic Speaker of the House from Kentucky, had been particularly effective in rallying support for military action. At 35, Clay embodied the spirit of a new generation of Americans who had not lived through the Revolutionary War but had grown up hearing stories of British oppression. For Clay and his allies, the continued British interference with American shipping and the suspected British support of Native American attacks on the frontier represented an intolerable assault on national honor. John Caldwell Calhoun of South Carolina, another prominent war hawk, had delivered passionate speeches in the House of Representatives arguing that America's choice was between war and national degradation. These young politicians represented a stark contrast to the older Federalists, who remembered the costs of war and feared that conflict with Britain would destroy the American economy. The Federalists, led by figures like Rufus King of New York and Josiah Quincy of Massachusetts, argued for continued negotiation and economic pressure rather than military confrontation. Madison himself was deeply conflicted about the prospect of war, a scholar and political theorist rather than a military leader. He understood better than most the enormous challenges facing the United States in any conflict with Britain. The Royal Navy commanded the seas with more than 600 warships, while the American Navy consisted of fewer than 20 vessels. The British Army, though engaged primarily in fighting Napoleon in Europe, still maintained significant forces in Canada and could potentially draw upon experienced veterans of the Peninsula Campaign. The American military situation was particularly concerning, as the regular army numbered fewer than 7,000 men, scattered across a frontier that stretched from Maine to Georgia and west to the Mississippi River. The state militias, upon which the nation would have to rely heavily, varied enormously in training, equipment, and leadership. Some units, particularly in New England, were well organized and disciplined, while others existed mainly on paper. The bitter memories of militia failures during the Revolutionary War haunted Madison's calculations about American military prospects. However, the provocations continued to mount, making neutrality increasingly difficult to maintain. In May 1812, news reached Washington that the British had extended their naval blockade to include American ports, effectively declaring economic war on the United States. This action came on top of continued impressment of American sailors and reports from the Northwest Territory of increased British arms shipments to hostile Native American tribes, as referenced in diplomatic correspondence preserved in the National Archives. British Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh had shown little inclination to compromise on the fundamental issues dividing the two nations. The British government, fully engaged in its lifeward struggle with Napoleon, viewed American complaints as secondary concerns at best. British officials consistently maintained their right to search neutral vessels and impress British subjects, regardless of whether they had become American citizens. The situation in the Northwest Territory had also continued to deteriorate. Governor William Henry Harrison of the Indiana Territory reported increasing Native American attacks on American settlements, attacks that he attributed directly to British encouragement and support. The victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe in November 1811 had temporarily disrupted Tecumseh's Confederacy, but reports suggested that the Shawnee leader was actively working to rebuild his alliance and was receiving British support in these efforts. On June 1st, 1812, Madison made his fateful decision. He sent a message to Congress requesting a declaration of war against Great Britain, citing continued impressment of American sailors, violations of American territorial waters, the British blockade of American commerce, and British support for Native American attacks on American settlements. The message represented a careful balance between the demands of the warhawks and Madison's own reluctance to commit the nation to a conflict, whose outcome remained highly uncertain. The congressional debate that followed was intense and often bitter. Federalist speakers argued that war would bring economic ruin and potentially destroy the Union itself. They pointed to the weakness of American military forces and the danger of aligning the United States, even indirectly, with Napoleon's France against Britain. Warhawks countered that continued submission to British aggression would reduce America to a British colony in all but name, making independence meaningless. The vote, when it finally came on June 18, 1812, was closer than the Warhawks had hoped. The House of Representatives approved the declaration by 17-9 votes to 49. While the Senate's margin was even narrower at 19-13, the geographical divisions were stark, with New England and much of New York opposing the war, while the South and West generally supported it. Madison signed the declaration into law, making the War of 1812 officially America's second conflict with its former colonial master. General William Hull stood at the window of his headquarters in Detroit, watching the morning mist rise from the Detroit River as July faded into August 1812. At 59, the Revolutionary War veteran had been chosen to lead America's first major offensive of the Warren invasion of British-controlled Upper Canada. Hull commanded nearly 2,000 men, a mix of regular soldiers and Ohio militia, and his mission seemed straightforward: cross into Canada, capture key British positions, and demonstrate to the world that the United States was serious about prosecuting this war. Yet as Hull gazed across the river toward the British fortifications at Fort Malden, he felt a growing sense of unease. His supply lines stretched precariously back through the wilderness to Ohio, constantly threatened by British-allied Native American war parties led by Tecumseh. More troubling still, Hull had learned that the British controlled Lake Erie with their naval forces, meaning his army could be cut off from reinforcement or retreat at any moment. The war's opening moves had revealed the enormous challenges facing both sides in this conflict. President Madison had hoped that the conquest of Canada would be, in Thomas Jefferson's famous phrase, a mere matter of marching. The logic seemed sound. Canada's population of perhaps 500,000 was dwarfed by America's 7.5 million people, and many Canadian settlers were recent American immigrants who might welcome liberation from British rule. However, the reality proved far more complex. Major General Isaac Brock, the British commander in Upper Canada, had proven himself a master of psychological warfare and strategic maneuvering. Brock understood that his regular forces were vastly outnumbered, but he also recognized that his Native American allies, particularly Tecumseh's warriors, could provide crucial mobility and local knowledge. The partnership between the experienced British officer and the charismatic Shawnee leader would prove one of the war's most effective alliances. Hull's invasion began, promisingly enough, in mid-July, when his forces crossed the Detroit River and established a beachhead on Canadian soil. He issued a proclamation promising liberation to Canadian settlers and threatening dire consequences for anyone who fought alongside Native American allies. However, Hull's advance soon stalled, as reports reached him of British and Native American forces gathering to the east and north. The psychological pressure proved too much for the aging general. He began to worry obsessively about his supply lines and the safety of Detroit itself. The naval situation on the Great Lakes had quickly emerged as crucial to the war's outcome. In the Northern Theater, the British maintained naval superiority on most of the lakes, allowing them to move troops and supplies quickly while threatening American positions along the shoreline. On Lake Erie, the British squadron based at Fort Malden could intercept American supply convoys and support British operations along the Detroit frontier, as chronicled in military records housed at the Smithsonian Institution. First significant military action of the war occurred not in Canada, but on the Niagara frontier, where American forces launched a surprise attack on the British position at Queenston Heights on October 13, 1812. The battle began before dawn, when American troops under Colonel Solomon Van Rensselaer crossed the Niagara River and scaled the heights overlooking the village of Queenston. The attack initially succeeded, catching the British garrison by surprise. However, General Brock, who had rushed to the scene from his headquarters at Fort George, was killed while leading a counterattack to retake the heights. His death sent shockwaves through the British forces in Canada, but it also galvanized British and Canadian resistance. Brock had become a symbol of effective leadership and determination, and his martyrdom would inspire Canadian defenders throughout the war. The battle's outcome ultimately favored the British, due to the refusal of New York militia to cross the international border and support their regular army comrades. This limitation, rooted in constitutional questions about the militia's role in offensive operations, would plague American military efforts throughout the war. American forces on the heights found themselves isolated and outnumbered as British reinforcements arrived. Major General Roger Halesheaf, Brock's successor, methodically organized a counterattack that forced the Americans back across the river with heavy losses. Meanwhile, Hull's position in Detroit had become increasingly precarious. Brock, before his death at Queenston, had demonstrated his strategic brilliance by moving rapidly between theaters of operation. After receiving reports of Hull's invasion, Brock had traveled quickly to the Detroit frontier with reinforcements, including Native American warriors under Tecumseh. The British commander understood that aggressive action might compensate for his numerical disadvantage. On August 16, 1812, Brock demanded Hull's surrender, accompanying his ultimatum with carefully orchestrated psychological pressure. British forces paraded visibly within sight of Detroit's walls, while Tecumseh's warriors made their presence known through war cries and demonstrations. Brock's message warned Hull that Native American forces might prove difficult to control once fighting began, implying a massacre of civilians if the Americans resisted. Hull, already demoralized by supply problems and worried about the safety of Detroit's inhabitants, made the fateful decision to surrender without firing a shot. His capitulation shocked the American public and handed the British an enormous propaganda victory. Not only did the British capture Hull's entire army of over 2,000 men, but they also gained control of the Michigan Territory and a substantial quantity of military supplies. The surrender at Detroit represented a catastrophic beginning to America's Second War with Britain. The loss eliminated American forces in the Northwest and exposed the entire frontier to British and Native American attack. Hull's disgrace would later result in his court-martial and death sentence, though. President Madison eventually commuted the punishment to dismissal from service. Captain Isaac Hull of the USS Constitution felt the deck roll beneath his feet as his frigate cut through the Atlantic swells on August 19, 1812. The irony of his name was not lost on the naval officer, while his distant relative, General William Hull, had brought shame upon the family name with his surrender at Detroit. Captain Hull was about to restore American honor in spectacular fashion. Through his telescope, he could see the British frigate HMS Guerriere bearing down on his position, her battle flag streaming in the wind. The naval war had begun, with most observers expecting swift British dominance. The Royal Navy possessed over 600 warships worldwide, including more than 100 ships of the line massive vessels carrying 74 to 120 guns each. Against this armada, the United States Navy could muster only 17 vessels, including 3 heavy frigates: Constitution, United States, and President. American naval strategy would necessarily focus on commerce raiding and single-ship actions rather than fleet engagements. However, the American frigates possessed certain advantages that would prove crucial in the coming battles. With live oak timber from Georgia's coast, they were larger and more heavily constructed than their British counterparts. The Constitution, for example, carried 44 guns compared to the 38 typically mounted by British frigates. More importantly, American crews were well-trained professionals who had honed their skills during the quasi-war with France and subsequent operations against the Barbary pirates. The battle between Constitution and Guerriere lasted less than an hour but resonated throughout both nations for the remainder of the war. Captain Hull maneuvered his ship with consummate skill, avoiding the British vessel's initial broadside before positioning Constitution for devastating raking fire. The British frigate's mizzenmast fell first, followed by her mainmast, leaving Guerrero wallowing helplessly in the swells. When British shot bounced harmlessly off Constitution's thick sides, an American sailor reportedly shouted, "Her sides are made of iron," giving birth to the frigate's nickname Old Ironsides. The surrender of Guerrero sent shockwaves through Britain, where naval defeats were virtually unknown.
Ow.
The London Times declared the victory a calamity and worried about its effect on British prestige worldwide. For Americans, still reeling from the disaster at Detroit, Hull's triumph provided desperately needed proof that American forces could match British professionals in combat. The victory also demonstrated the potential of commerce raiding. As Guerrero had been hunting American merchant vessels when she encountered Constitution, as documented in naval records maintained by the Naval History and Heritage Command, success continued throughout the fall of 1812. In October, Captain Stephen Decatur, commanding USS's United States, defeated HMS Macedonian in another frigate duel, while Captain Jacob Jones in USS Wasp captured HMS Frolic in a fierce engagement that left both vessels severely damaged. These victories could not offset British numerical superiority, but they provided crucial morale boosts for American forces and demonstrated that British naval invincibility was a myth. The war's focus gradually shifted from the Canadian frontier to the Chesapeake Bay region as British strategy evolved. Following Napoleon's disastrous Russian campaign in 1812, Britain found itself with increased military resources available for the American war. The British government decided to escalate the conflict significantly, moving beyond defensive operations in Canada to direct attacks on American territory. Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane assumed command of British naval forces in American waters, with instructions to bring the war home to American civilians. Cochrane, whose brother had been killed fighting Americans during the Revolutionary War, brought personal animosity to his mission. His strategy focused on naval blockade, coastal raids, and attacks on American commerce designed to strangle the American economy and force a negotiated peace on British terms. The British blockade proved devastatingly effective. By 1813, Royal Navy squadrons had sealed most American ports from Charleston to New York. With only New England initially exempted due to Federalist opposition to the war, American customs revenues plummeted, while the costs of imported goods skyrocketed. Coastal communities lived in constant fear of British raids, forcing the diversion of military resources from offensive operations to coastal defense. The situation reached crisis proportions in 1814 when British forces began major operations against American territory. The burning of Washington, D.C. in August 1814 represented the war's most humiliating moment for the United States. Major General Robert Ross landed approximately 4,000 British troops at Benedict, Maryland, and marched overland toward the American capital. The British force encountered American defenders at Bladensburg, Maryland, in a battle that quickly became known as the Bladensburg Races due to the rapid retreat of American militia forces. President Madison himself had ridden out to observe the battle, becoming the first and only American president to come under enemy fire while in office. The sight of their own president fleeing the battlefield alongside militia units completed the demoralization of American forces. Secretary of War John Armstrong's inadequate preparations for Washington's defense had left the capital virtually unprotected against determined assault. The British occupation of Washington lasted only 26 hours. But the psychological impact proved enormous. Ross's forces systematically burned most government buildings, including the Capitol, President's House, and the Treasury. The destruction was largely retaliation for American burning of York Modern Toronto the previous year. But it struck at the heart of American national symbolism. First Lady Dolly Madison became a national heroine for saving George Washington's portrait from the President's house before fleeing the city. However, the British advance on Baltimore proved less successful. Fort McHenry, guarding Baltimore's harbor, withstood a 25-hour bombardment on September 13th and 14th, 1814. Francis Scott Key, watching the bombardment from a British ship where he had gone to negotiate a prisoner exchange, penned the verses that would become the Star-Spangled Banner after seeing the American flag still flying over the fort at dawn. Successful defense of Baltimore marked a turning point in American morale and demonstrated that determined resistance could repel British attacks. The death of General Ross during the approach to Baltimore also deprived the British of their most capable commander in the Chesapeake theater, reducing the effectiveness of subsequent operations. The silence across Lake Erie seemed almost supernatural. As Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry surveyed the British fleet through his telescope on the morning of September 10th, from the deck of his flagship USS Lawrence, the 28-year-old naval officer could see 6 British vessels under the command of Captain Robert Harriet Berkeley arrayed in battle formation near Poutine Bay. Perry commanded 9 American ships of varying sizes, hastily constructed at the shipyard in Presque Isle, Pennsylvania, using green timber and manned by a mixture of experienced sailors and raw recruits. The battle for control of Lake Erie would determine the fate of the entire northwestern theater of the war. Since General Hull's disgrace at Detroit, American forces had struggled to regain the initiative in this region. The British naval squadron based at Fort Malden had maintained supply lines to British positions along the Detroit River while supporting Native American attacks on American settlements. Perry's mission was simple in concept, but enormously challenging in execution. Destroy British naval power on Lake Erie and open the way for American land forces to retake Detroit and invade Upper Canada. Perry had spent months preparing for this moment, overcoming incredible obstacles in the process. The construction of his fleet at Presque Isle had required transporting naval cannon overland from Pittsburgh, a journey of more than 100 miles through wilderness. Skilled shipwrights and naval supplies had to be brought from the east coast, while local timber was cut and seasoned as quickly as possible. The British had attempted to interfere with these preparations through raids and diplomatic pressure on Native American allies. But Perry had persevered through determination and skillful organization. The British squadron, while smaller than Perry's force, possessed significant advantages in experience and training. Captain Berkeley was a veteran of Trafalgar and other major naval battles, while most of his officers and crew had extensive experience in European waters. The British ships were also better supplied with long-range cannon, giving them potential advantages in the opening phases of any engagement. However, Berkeley faced his own supply problems. As the American blockade of Lake Ontario had reduced the flow of naval stores to the upper lakes, as the two fleets closed for battle, Perry flew a banner inscribed with the dying words of Captain James Lawrence, "Don't give up the ship." Lawrence had commanded USS Chesapeake when she was defeated by HMS Shannon earlier that year, and his final exhortation had become a rallying cry for the American Navy. Perry's choice to display these words reflected both his determination and his understanding of what defeat would mean for American prospects in the Northwest. The Battle of Lake Erie began around noon, with long-range exchanges between the opposing fleets. British gunnery initially proved more effective, with Berkeley's flagship HMS Detroit concentrating fire on Perry's Lawrence. The American flagship suffered severe damage, with most of her crew killed or wounded within the first 2 hours of fighting. Perry himself was forced to abandon Lawrence when she became unmanageable, rowing through enemy fire to reach his second ship, USS Niagara. From the deck of Niagara, Perry reorganized his attack and broke through the British line, bringing concentrated firepower to bear on the British flagship Detroit. Captain Berkeley was severely wounded early in this phase of the battle. British resistance began to crumble as their ships suffered cumulative damage from American gunfire. One by one, the British vessels struck their colors, till Perry found himself in control of the entire enemy fleet. Perry's victory, dispatched to General William Henry Harrison, became one of the most famous messages in American military history. "We have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." The complete capture of the British Lake Erie squadron represented the first time in history that an entire Royal Navy fleet had surrendered to an enemy force. The victory opened the way for Harrison's army to cross into Canada and pursue British forces toward the Thames River, as recorded in military correspondence preserved at the William L. Clements Library. Harrison's invasion of Upper Canada proceeded rapidly, following Perry's naval victory. The British commander at Detroit, Major General Henry Proctor, found his position untenable with American forces controlling Lake Erie and cutting his supply lines. Proctor evacuated Detroit on September 27, 1813, beginning a retreat toward the Thames River that would prove disastrous for British interests in the Northwest. Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader who had proven such an effective ally to the British, strongly opposed Proctor's retreat. In a council of war, Tecumseh delivered an impassioned speech, comparing the British general to a fat animal that carries its tail upon its back, but when affrighted drops it between its legs and runs off. The Native American leader understood that retreat would expose his people to American vengeance and potentially destroy the Confederation he had spent years building. However, Proctor's military position was genuinely hopeless. Perry's control of Lake Erie meant that British forces could receive no reinforcements or supplies from the east. While Harrison's army, reinforced by Kentucky Mounted Volunteers under Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson, numbered nearly 3,000 men. The British regular force consisted of fewer than 800 soldiers, though they were accompanied by approximately 1,000 Native American warriors under Tecumseh's leadership. The pursuit culminated in the Battle of the Thames. On October 5, 1813, near present-day Chatham, Ontario, Harrison's forces, led by Johnson's mounted regiment, struck the British and Native American positions with overwhelming force. The British regulars, demoralized by weeks of retreat and short of ammunition, offered minimal resistance before surrendering. Proctor himself fled the battlefield early in the action, pleading his disgrace in British eyes. Tecumseh's death during the battle marked the end of effective Native American resistance in the Old Northwest. The Shawnee leader had fought to the end, attempting to rally his warriors against overwhelming odds. Various accounts credited Colonel Johnson with killing Tecumseh, though the exact circumstances remained disputed. What was certain was that the Confederation Tecumseh had built to resist. American expansion died with him on the banks of the Thames River. Harrison's victory eliminated British power in the Northwestern Theater and secured American control of the Michigan Territory and the Great Lakes region. The death of Tecumseh and the destruction of his confederation removed the last major obstacle to American settlement north of the Ohio River. For the remainder of the war, British forces in Upper Canada would be forced to focus on defending the St. Lawrence River Valley and the approaches to Montreal and Quebec. The morning mist still clung to the cypress swamps surrounding New Orleans as Major General Andrew Jackson rode through the American lines on January 7, 1815. Behind earthworks hastily constructed from cotton bales, mud, and timber, nearly 4,000 American defenders waited in tense silence. Across the Chalmette Plain, Jackson could see the scarlet ranks of British regulars forming for what would prove to be the final major battle of the War of 1812. Jackson's presence in New Orleans represented one of the war's most remarkable transformations. Just months earlier, the Tennessee lawyer and planter had been a relatively obscure frontier general known primarily for his harsh campaigns against Creek Indians in Alabama and Georgia. However, his devastating victory over British forces at the Battle of New Orleans would make him a national hero and eventually propel him to the presidency. The irony that this climactic battle occurred after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed in Europe was unknown to the combatants preparing for what they believed would be a decisive engagement. The British expedition against New Orleans represented the most ambitious operation of the war's final phase. Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, brother-in-law to the Duke of Wellington, commanded approximately 8,000 veteran troops, many of whom had served in the Peninsula Campaign against Napoleon. The strategic objective was to capture New Orleans and potentially gain control of the Mississippi River, thereby cutting American trade routes to the Western Territories and providing Britain with a powerful bargaining chip in peace negotiations. The approach to New Orleans had proven far more difficult than British planners had anticipated. The city's location, surrounded by swamps, lakes, and the winding Mississippi River, offered limited routes for a large army to approach the urban center. British forces had been forced to navigate through Lake Borgne and land at a point approximately 9 miles below the city and advance across difficult terrain toward Jackson's prepared positions. Jackson had used the time afforded by British logistical difficulties to excellent advantage. His forces represented one of the most diverse American armies of the war, including regular troops, Tennessee and Kentucky militia, Louisiana volunteers, free men of color from New Orleans, and even pirates under the leadership of Jean Lafitte. The inclusion of Lafitte's men had proven particularly valuable, as the pirates possessed detailed knowledge of the waterways around New Orleans and provided much-needed artillery expertise, as detailed in battle accounts preserved at the historic New Orleans collection. Jackson's defensive preparations had transformed the approach to New Orleans into a killing field. His engineers had constructed a formidable earthwork extending from the Mississippi River to the edge of an impassable swamp, creating a bottleneck through which any British attack would have to pass. Artillery positions had been carefully sited to provide overlapping fields of fire, while sharpshooters from Tennessee and Kentucky occupied positions along the American line. The British plan called for a frontal assault supported by flanking movements through the swamps and a diversionary attack across the Mississippi River. However, coordination problems plagued the operation from the beginning. The flanking force became lost in the maze of waterways and swamps, while the diversionary attack failed to achieve its objectives. This left Pakenham with little choice but to proceed with a direct assault against Jackson's prepared positions. The battle itself lasted less than 2 hours, but resulted in one of the most one-sided victories in American military history. As British columns advanced across the open plain toward the American earthworks, they encountered devastating artillery and small arms fire. The accuracy of Tennessee and Kentucky riflemen proved particularly deadly, picking off British officers and disrupting the formation of attacking columns. Pakenham himself was killed early in the assault, struck down while attempting to rally his troops for another attack. British casualties at New Orleans exceeded 2,000 men killed, wounded, and missing, while American losses totaled fewer than 100. The disparity reflected both the strength of Jackson's defensive position and the tactical obsolescence of frontal assaults against prepared positions defended by riflemen. The battle demonstrated how American military capabilities had evolved since the early disasters of 1812, when poor leadership and inadequate preparation had led to repeated defeats. The victory at New Orleans had profound implications for American national identity and political development. Jackson's success against veteran British troops proved that American citizen soldiers could defeat the world's most professional army when properly led and positioned. The general's egalitarian approach to command, treating militia and regulars with equal respect, embodied democratic ideals that resonated throughout the young republic. The battle also highlighted the complex racial dynamics of the early American republic. The significant contributions of free men of color to the American victory challenged prevailing assumptions about African American military capabilities and loyalty. However, these contributions were quickly forgotten in the post-war period as sectional tensions over slavery intensified. While similarly, Jackson's willingness to work with Jean Lafitte's pirates demonstrated the pragmatic approach necessary for frontier warfare. Even as it raised questions about law and order in the expanding republic, news of the victory reached Washington in early February 1815, arriving almost simultaneously with word that peace negotiations had concluded successfully in Ghent. The timing proved fortuitous for American negotiators. It as Jackson's triumph strengthened the American bargaining position and helped offset earlier military failures. The victory also provided a triumphant conclusion to a war that had often seemed to teeter on the edge of disaster for the United States. Jackson's success at New Orleans established patterns that would influence American military thinking for decades to come. The effectiveness of defensive positions manned by citizen soldiers became a cornerstone of American strategic thinking. While Jackson's personal leadership style would serve as a model for future commanders, the battle's outcome also reinforced American confidence in their ability to defend their territory against European powers, contributing to the assertive foreign policy that would characterize the Monroe Doctrine and subsequent American expansion. The bells of Ghent Cathedral chimed midnight on Christmas Eve, 1814, as British and American negotiators put the finishing touches on a treaty that would end the War of 1812. In the candlelit chamber of the medieval Carthusian monastery that housed the peace conference, men who had spent months in bitter disagreement now prepared to sign an agreement that would reshape relations between their nations for generations to come. The American delegation, led by former President John Quincy Adams, had arrived in Europe with instructions that seemed almost impossible to achieve. President Madison and his cabinet had demanded British recognition of American maritime rights, an end to impressment, compensation for wartime damages, and potentially territorial concessions in Canada. The British delegation, headed by Admiral Lord Gambier, initially sought to create an independent Native American buffer state in the Northwest Territory and demanded significant territorial concessions along the Canadian border. However, the changing military situation in Europe had gradually altered the negotiating climate throughout 1814. Napoleon's abdication in April had freed British military resources for the American War, leading to the successful British operations in the Chesapeake region, including the burning of Washington. Yet Napoleon's return during the 100 Days and the continuing costs of maintaining large military forces in North America had also created pressure on the British government to reach a reasonable settlement. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on December 24, 1814, represented a compromise that satisfied neither side's initial demands, but reflected the military realities both nations faced. The agreement essentially restored the status quo ante bellum, turning all conquered territory and establishing commissions to resolve boundary disputes along the Canadian border. Most significantly, the treaty made no mention of impressment, maritime rights, or the other issues that had ostensibly caused the war. As documented in diplomatic archives maintained by the Department of State, the treaty's silence on maritime issues reflected the changed circumstances created by Napoleon's defeat. With the end of the European wars, British naval policies that had so angered Americans became largely irrelevant. The Royal Navy no longer needed to maintain massive fleets or impress sailors on the scale that had characterized the Napoleonic period. British officials calculated correctly that these issues would resolve themselves without formal concessions. The treaty's ratification process revealed the deep divisions the war had created within American society. New England Federalists, who had opposed the conflict from the beginning, had actually convened the Hartford Convention in December 1814 to discuss potential constitutional amendments that would limit the federal government's ability to wage war without broad consensus. Some extreme Federalists had even discussed secession, though cooler heads ultimately prevailed. The Hartford Convention's proceedings, though moderate in their final form, proved politically disastrous for the Federalist Party. News of Jackson's victory at New Orleans and the peace treaty reached New England just as the convention concluded, making Federalist complaints appear unpatriotic and defeatist. The party never recovered from the stigma of appearing to undermine the war effort at the moment of American triumph. The war's conclusion brought immediate relief to both nations, but its long-term consequences would prove far more significant than the treaty's modest terms suggested. For the United States, the War of 1812 had served as a second war of independence, finally establishing American credibility as a sovereign nation capable of defending its interests against European powers. The successful defense of Baltimore, Jackson's triumph at New Orleans, and naval victories on the Great Lakes had created a new sense of national confidence and unity. The economic consequences of the war proved transformative for American development. The British blockade had forced Americans to develop domestic manufacturing capabilities, laying the foundation for the country's industrial revolution. New England textile mills, Pennsylvania ironworks, and other manufacturing enterprises had emerged during the war years, reducing American dependence on British imports. This industrial development would accelerate dramatically in the post-war period, fundamentally altering the American economy. The war also reshaped American political culture in profound ways. The Federalist Party's opposition to the conflict and the Hartford Convention's apparent disloyalty destroyed its national viability, leaving the Democratic-Republican Party in complete control of federal politics. This political dominance would persist until new party alignments emerged in the 1820s and 30s. The war heroes, particularly Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison, would dominate American politics for the next generation. Perhaps most significantly, the War of 1812 eliminated the last serious threat of Native American resistance to American expansion. Tecumseh's death and the destruction of his confederation removed the most formidable obstacle to westward settlement. In the South, Jackson's earlier campaigns against the Creek Nation had achieved similar results. The post-war period would witness unprecedented territorial expansion as Americans moved into former Native American lands in overwhelming numbers. The international implications of the war extended far beyond North America. Britain's experience in the conflict convinced British policymakers that the costs of maintaining hostile relations with the United States outweighed any potential benefits. The Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817 limited naval forces on the Great Lakes, while subsequent boundary settlements resolved territorial disputes peacefully. The foundation was laid for the special relationship that would eventually develop between the two English-speaking powers. For Canada, the war had created a distinct national identity, separate from both Britain and the United States. Canadian militia and British regulars had successfully defended their territory against American invasion, creating a sense of Canadian nationalism that had not existed before the conflict. Heroes like Isaac Brock became symbols of Canadian resistance and determination. While the successful defense against American expansion strengthened ties to Britain that would persist for more than a century, the War of 1812 thus marked a crucial turning point in North American history. What had begun as a conflict over maritime rights and territorial disputes had evolved into a struggle that would determine the future development of the entire continent. The young United States had proven its ability to survive and thrive as an independent nation, while Canada had discovered its own identity through successful resistance. Britain had learned to treat its former colonies as equals worthy of respect and accommodation. The legacy of Mr. Madison's War, as some called it, would echo through American history for generations. The confidence gained from surviving the conflict would fuel the territorial expansion, industrial development, and political assertiveness that characterized the 19th century. From the ashes of burned Washington and the triumph at New Orleans, had emerged a nation ready to claim its place among the great powers of the world.